All right, welcome to the Living Fund podcast. We have Neil Gyte joining us today from Metabolic Wise. Neil, why don't you just take us through a little bit of your background and your journey?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, thank you very much for having me, Rob. Looking forward to the conversation. So yeah, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Metabolic Wise, a newly launched health education platform rooted in metabolic health science and evidence to help educate people on the true root cause of chronic disease. And kind of, I would say, the journey and the backstory into this is really, I would say, my own health journey and the impact of chronic disease on family and loved ones, which really got me kind of digging into what causes ultimately these chronic diseases, as well as optimal health, and the kind of realization that actually a lot of what we have been told and kind of learned over the last 30, 40 years isn't really the true kind of root cause of a lot of these conditions. And so my own health journey really started when I was in my late 20s and I was massively overweight, 260 pounds, and I'm sure pre-diabetic and the fast track to an early grave. Becoming a father was kind of my motivation for change, and I realized I couldn't be an active father. So I went on kind of my own journey, ended up getting into exercise, being, more cautious about what I ate, and ultimately got kind of into the ultra endurance world through that and got fascinated in how the body utilizes and creates kind of energy. So that was, I would say, kind of my first learning arc around health and ultimately metabolic health. But then in parallel, I had family and loved ones being impacted by chronic diseases, from my best friends at school being diagnosed with bipolar and mental health conditions to a close family member with a stage 4 cancer diagnosis that really got me digging into what causes cancer, how do you stop, how do you reverse cancer. And it was through that that I understood and kind of got to know the amazing work of Professor Seafried and the metabolic approach and theory to cancer, which makes you kind of totally kind of stand on its head everything that you kind of think that you know about cancer. And ultimately, there are thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands, that have successfully reversed even stage 4, cancer diagnosis using metabolic therapy. And so once I really dug into the knowledge and then literature around that, and at the time I was working at Google, I had 20 years in technology, 12 of those working at Google, building the Google Maps and Google Earth platform and developer business. I kind of realized that the world of digital mapping kind of was in safe hands. Everybody had access to Google Maps or Apple Maps, but ultimately you could reverse these chronic diseases which affect, the vast majority of people on this planet through natural means, but nobody knows about this. And so there were billions of people really suffering unnecessarily. And so I decided to leave Google and set myself a new personal mission to help a billion plus people become metabolically healthy. And that ultimately led to meeting my two co-founders, Steve and Jess, and founding Metabolic Wise.
But tell us a little bit more about what you're building at Metabolic Wise.
Yeah, of course. So Metabolic Wise, we're really trying to solve the current problem, which is the current healthcare system and paradigm is very good at acute care, but it fails epically at chronic disease, and that's evidenced by some of the stats that we were just discussing, where 93% of Americans are metabolically dysfunctional, 72% of chronic diseases. Um, Basically 72% of deaths, sorry, worldwide are related to, chronic diseases, which is some 42 million people a year. And back 100 years ago, these chronic diseases just largely did not exist. So the current healthcare system is not very good at treating them. At the same time, people are lost in a sea of conflicting online health information. And the main resources that people go to, Google, ChatGPT, they actually don't have metabolic root cause understanding of the major chronic diseases. And so the answers generally reflect most of the science over the last 30, 40, 50 years, which has been big food, pharma, and tech driven and, and focused on isolated biomarkers rather than root cause health outcomes. So cardiovascular disease is a great example of this, where so much focus has been on, LDL and how do you reduce LDL, but that is just, one small component of actually what creates cardiovascular disease and is actually very, misunderstood. And so Metabolic Wise is a new health AI platform trained in metabolic health science and education, really focus on the root cause of these chronic diseases. And it's there to help educate people much more on these kind of root causes and then much more natural based therapies to counter these kind of the root causes of the chronic disease, the majority of which are, our modern kind of lifestyle inflicted. So it's really to help people understand their evolutionary biology, get wise to their evolutionary biology, wise to themselves, and ultimately educate yourself into how you can put in place preventative strategies to minimize your chances of getting any of these chronic diseases. And the evidence around use of metabolic therapy is just overwhelming in terms of people reversing everything from stage 4 cancer diagnoses to reversing diabetes to reversing even mental health conditions like bipolar and schizophrenia using metabolic therapies. So there are so many natural tools that people can use to help manage these diseases, but it's really to educate people on kind of the fundamental root causes, which ultimately does get down to the cell level and the mitochondria level, but we educate that in a hopefully in a very accessible and simple way and really try to simplify the science into actionable kind of knowledge nuggets and lifestyle things that people can do to help to help them reverse and prevent chronic disease.
Had you considered staying at Google to work on this internally?
Good question. I did not know, only because the challenge, and it's one of the reasons why I think Google ChatGPT and the others will struggle for this. Their platform's very good. If you've got a very specific prompt or if you've got a very specific question, then it can go and find that knowledge. But the vast majority of people wouldn't know to look for how is fourth phase water or structured water connected to cardiovascular disease, which is actually kind of critical to your cardiovascular system because there is a very small kind of, I would say, set of research around that, which is very robust, but it's overwhelmed by the, thousands of studies around, how statins and other drugs can lower LDL levels, and LDL is ultimately kind of, the main causative factor is heart disease. So you actually have to take a little bit more of an opinionated view. And because these models are trained on all of the world's information, the kind of metabolic science is really kind of drowned out. And so I don't, which is why you're seeing so many vertical kind of AIs spring up, because ultimately these kind of large language models can't necessarily understand that a small amount of the research actually reflects kind of true root cause. So I don't think Google will be able to solve this problem unless they specifically decided to, and they tend to obviously err on the side of kind of optimizing for the world's information resources and not necessarily taking opinionated views on things.
So if I'm more of a layperson who's first getting into what can I do from a lifestyle approach to deal with symptoms or diagnosis that's chronic illness related, uh, will Metabolic Wise be for that person?
Absolutely. So that's exactly who it's designed for. So it's really designed for simplicity. So if you go to metabolicwise.com and if you just type in, what causes heart disease or what causes cancer, you will get immediate kind of response rooted in metabolic kind of science and evidence, which explains these diseases in a very different light than, largely genetics and, some kind of immediate lifestyle things like obviously, smoking and other kind of toxins are linked to cancer, but the prevailing paradigm is that it's largely a genetic disease that the kind of ultimately, mutations kind of cause this, but ultimately they actually are both conditions of mitochondrial dysfunction at its root cause. So we educate around that, but then we also provide, simple follow-up questions. So if you, for example, put in just heart disease, you will get kind of a perspective on heart disease, which is really focused on ultimately kind of inflammation, insulin resistance, but also some other concepts which most people aren't familiar with. For example, easy water or fourth phase structured water, which is actually critical for your cardiovascular system. And so to kind of explain what that is, effectively, water has a fourth phase, which is a kind of a gel-like state, but only gets into that fourth phase through specific environmental inputs. of which natural sunlight, infrared light, is actually one of those. And so exposure to infrared light helps you build structured water, which then ultimately kind of lines all of your blood vessels and arteries. And kind of doing so, it provides a firstly kind of a protective layer that protects the glycocalyx. Second thing is because it's kind of it's a hydrophilic layer, it also helps your effectively blood flow much more effectively through the body. But if you don't, for example, get exposure to natural light to create this fourth phase water, then ultimately you're not creating that kind of gel-like structure which helps protect and kind of move blood flow. So that's very, you won't find this unless you specifically search for it on any of the other health platforms, but we include that as part of kind of, one of the key components. And then what's the simple thing that somebody can do is start, getting, enough sunlight each day, getting kind of, morning sunrise, exposing yourself to that, which helps one, set your circadian rhythm. Secondly, helps your body build that structured water, which can then ultimately help your cardiovascular health. So that's, I would say, one kind of, tiny example. But obviously the way kind of chatbots work, or the way we've structured Metabolic Wise, is really to give you kind of a broad overview of each of these things and allow you to, then dig into kind of what you think is most appropriate for you. And so it could be, if you feel like I already spend a lot of time outside, I'm getting good natural light, maybe focusing on inflammation and what causes inflammation. So then you can go down these rabbit warrens of what the specific components are of these diseases, and therefore kind of what are a good lifestyle options that you can start with. So it's really designed for ease of use to help pique people's curiosity, but also explain the science in a simple way.
So, yeah, fascinating. A couple of topics that come to mind for me that might be sort of, in the minds and thoughts of viewers is topics like long COVID. Uh, should I take GLP-1s?
Yeah, so let's start with GLP-1s actually, because that I would say there's probably more broader, I would say, science and evidence around GLP-1s, which does make it a little bit easier because we do need to strike the balance between is there enough kind of science and evidence, behind this. And I would say COVID and long COVID, a lot of that is coming, but it's still, I would say, relatively new. And so there is still, I would say, yeah, kind of a bunch of different counts, but we can come to long COVID as a second. But certainly in terms of GLP-1 drugs, I think the first thing is we always look at things through kind of an evolutionary perspective. So how do you understand these kind of, root cause pathways and ultimately, what causes, I would say, obesity, weight gain in the first place, and therefore how can you manage that naturally? And there are, great kind of randomized controlled trials and studies that show that lifestyle interventions like a low carbohydrate diet and other metabolic interventions can lead to equivalent, if not greater, weight loss than using GLP-1s. At the same time, GLP-1s are, kind of an easier solution, but they come with a bunch of different side effects. So the way we approach that is we understand this kind of science and evidence, and we present effectively a nuanced view, which is GLP-1s, can be useful, but you need to do them in combination with lifestyle interventions because otherwise you are at high risk of muscle loss, etc. But there are actually natural ways that you can do this to really kind of inform the user, and hopefully people do decide. And there are a bunch of side effects with GLP-1s. There's very little side effects if you take kind of, the natural therapy route. So we're always trying to provide users with, guide towards more natural lifestyle, because ultimately that is in tune with your evolutionary biology and your mitochondrial signals, which ultimately kind of dictate a lot of how the body's metabolism and environment for disease work. At the same time, GLP-1s, for those who really have tried every other way and just they need that kickstart, like my own personal kind of metaphor I use for GLP-1s is it's a little bit like going to the gym and using the kind of the weight assist on the pull-up machine. And so it can give you that immediate kind of, okay, right, I can see, I can, actually do a pull-up with some weight assist. But the trick is then you really need to start reducing the weight so you're taking the full load. So ultimately you only use it as a short-term, few months kind of thing whilst you do the lifestyle changes. Because if you don't do the lifestyle changes, you'll actually never fundamentally solve the root cause. And I would say cancer is another disease which is similar to that. You can do all of the kind of the surgeries and treatments, but unless you focus on the root cause, environment, and terrain that creates the environment that cancer thrives on in the first place, that cancer is likely to come back, at some point. And so you really need to focus on the root cause. And I don't think any of the pharmacological options out there truly look at the root cause, because there's not one single thing or one single drug. It's a combination of signals that mitochondria need to ultimately put your cells and issues in the optimal environment to kind of thrive and grow. And that's why I think that is the only true way to restore kind of health and optimal living and optimal vitality, because our mitochondria evolved over 1.5 billion years to be super sensitive, to these inputs. And so certainly for now, I don't think there's anything as powerful as using kind of natural metabolic therapies of, nutrition inputs of light on and other things to really restore mitochondrial function.
Is there a laundry list of the top few items that you would do if you were to recommend to somebody new to trying to working on their improving their health?
Um, yes, there is. This is where I do think it is personal individuals. So I think it's one of the challenges is people always think, oh, let me find that one thing, that one supplement, the one thing that I'm going to do, which is going to, solve everything else. I think the reality is we've all got our own health jigsaw puzzles, and you really need to, and some of those jigsaw puzzles are a lot more complicated than others. Some people have simpler jigsaw puzzles. And so I think you really need to commit into how do I best build my jigsaw puzzles? And you have to, separate the colors out, understand where you want to start, and start kind of building your jigsaw. So I don't mean to, I would say, avoid the answer per se, but a lot of it is nuanced. But I do think if you look at I would say for me, I think the two biggest foundational things that you can do, actually, no, I'm going to expand it to the three kind of key areas, but which one you start with is going to be kind of contextual for you. I think the first thing ultimately is kind of, nervous system safety. So ultimately, our nervous systems are kind of one of the foundational components of this. And so if you are in a high stress environment, if internally you are constantly sending stress signals to your body, and if your mitochondria are sensing those stress signals, ultimately it's very difficult to return that to a functional state if that is constantly kind of being perpetuated. So one, kind of understanding really your nervous system and kind of and stress management. The second thing is nutrition, just because, especially in the US, but in many countries, there is so much food out there in the ecosystem, which is just not kind of natural food. So just focusing on local, seasonal, organic, foods, and for the majority of people, lower in carbohydrate, because the vast majority of people are eating way too many carbs unnecessarily. They're not developing metabolic flexibility. That would be a second pillar. And the third pillar is really actually light related. So, just simply getting morning exposure to sunlight and setting the circadian rhythm and trying to minimize, non-natural sources of light, especially in the evenings, because ultimately, a little bit like the stress in the nervous system, our biology is wired to do different things at different time of the day, and it's sunlight that effectively sets that kind of clock that everything works in kind of in synchrony. So if you think about an orchestra, and kind of light is the conductor of the orchestra, if you're not getting those light signals, you've got all of the different parts of the orchestra, but none of them know how to play in tune and in sequence, and the outcome of that is not great. If you're getting those light signals, especially early morning, is kind of critical, but you really also do need to get other exposure throughout the day. Ideally, that helps sets the circadian rhythm that makes sure your body knows effectively what systems to ramp up and down at one time. And for me, it's the combination of, I would say, those three things that really create the foundation of health. Which one you want to start with, I guess, depends upon kind of which one you can most easily attend to, or which one is I would say, the biggest concern. And for some people, it might be all three. For others, it might be two out of three. And so for me, those are the kind of three foundational things that I really think that you need to start with.
When you set out to lose weight years back, what was the main areas that you focused on, and what was most effective for you?
Yeah, good question. So at the time, the main area I focused on really was nutrition. Just because I knew at the time I was just, kind of eat. I didn't know why. I just knew that I was eating way too much. Um, I just had no concept of what I was kind of putting into my body because I'd been an athlete for, I would say, many of my kind of teenage years and my early 20s. And then you can kind of, because your metabolism is so strong, you can kind of just throw anything at your body and you're doing enough exercise to counter most of it, although you can never, exercise off a bad diet. That is something that I have learned. But really nutrition was the main thing. So just cutting out really sugar, cutting out, refined carbohydrates. And honestly, the biggest lever for me was understanding the notion of metabolic flexibility. And it blew my mind when I realized that ultimately our kind of mitochondria, which do create energy as well as act as kind of, cellular environment sensors, can utilize, fat as a fuel source as well as carbohydrates. Because back at the time, I was starting to get into exercise and I was thinking, right, I need to go and load myself up with sugar and carbohydrates to go and do my gym workout. And just learning that actually, the body will happily burn fat as a fuel source was a light bulb kind of in my mind. And that really sent me down kind of the low carbohydrate approach, which I think is the most effective, I would say, way and most evolutionary appropriate. So I definitely would say nutrition was a big part of it. Second part was, exercise, but that was just because I did a lot when I was younger, and I really got the bug kind of back to do that. And so I ended up signing up for a triathlon, and before I knew it, I was doing longer and longer triathlons. And so I would say that helped accelerate it, but actually the majority of it was the nutritional changes that I made at the time.
Your exposure to fasting, um, and also your long distance swim in Scotland.
Yes, so both of them, yeah, highly related. So yeah, fasting. So I think as I really was on my own. So this is another thing that's really important. I think is if you commit to the journey of learning and understanding, it's a learning and understanding, and then implementing and figuring out what works for you, and then you've got almost kind of these different tools that you can use. And so at the start, I really wasn't. I would say the first couple of years, I didn't do much fasting. And then I started to learn more about fasting, more about kind of, the body operating in a fasted state. I started doing a lot more of my kind of triathlon training in a fasted state because when you're going, long, super long distances, full Ironmans, kind of 10 hours plus you're on the go, you really need to have a balance of fuel sources to fuel that. You can't just rely on carbohydrates. So I would say I started to use fasting there. I understood the importance of fasting as kind of a signal to help effectively kind of mitochondrial function and your body effectively kind of develop more mitochondria, which ultimately then spread the workload and mean you can go longer. But I would say it's only when I started to have kind of family and loved ones being hit by different chronic diseases, I then really started to dig in the fasting. Some of the work of Volta Longo, who developed kind of the fasting mimicking diet and protocol, and really is probably the world's leading researcher in kind of fasting as a metabolic tool to help in chronic diseases. He's done a ton of work on cancer. And then the out kind of comes of that are pretty amazing. If you look at it dramatically increases the effectiveness of chemotherapy. And this has been proven in randomized controlled trials because when your body's in a fasted state, your healthy cells effectively put up a kind of a form of self-protection. So they kind of signal I'm going into self-protection mode. So they kind of hunker down. But cancer cells, because ultimately they're not functioning normally, they don't do that. So they're still, operating, as a altered metabolic cancer cell. So then when you do chemotherapy, because your healthy cells are kind of in this protected state, you get effectively less damage of those healthy cells and you get much more kind of the cancer cells. You can also do much lower dose chemotherapy. And so as I started to dig into that and realize actually how important it was for I would say for chronic diseases, that led me kind of, more down the, oh wow, fasting is a really kind of powerful tool to help prevent and reverse these chronic diseases. And so ultimately, all of this kind of culminated in a close family member's stage 4 cancer kind of diagnosis, which at the time was very bleak outlook. Um, and as I dug into all this research and kind of realized all of this, and I was leaving Google and on this new path to help 1 billion+ people become metabolically healthy, I was like, what can I do? I'm kind of new in this world. What can I do to try and raise awareness for metabolic therapy, and fasting as a tool for all of these things? And at the time, my brother really got into long distance swimming, actually from his own mental health struggles. So he was really struggling with depression. And this was about maybe 5, 6 years ago. We went on a family holiday to the Lake District in England. I was training for a triathlon at the time, and we all used to do a lot of swimming when we were younger. So I just come back from one of my training swims, and so I just said to my younger brother Dave, I was like, why don't you jump in and have a swim in the lake? And he was like, oh yeah, I don't know, it's a bit cold. I was like, well, I'll lend you a wetsuit. Just jump in and have a swim. And so he ended up doing that. So he put my wetsuit on, he went in for a swim, and he just kind of swam across the lake and back. So maybe 10, 15 minutes. But even just that, he said when he came out of the water, it was like he had a new brain. So there was something about probably the impact of the cold water, as well as the exercise, as well as just kind of being in nature. Something in that triggered the signals and kind of in his brain just to ultimately switch. And so the rest of that day, it was like the fog had kind of lifted. But then the following day, the fog started coming back down again. But that was enough of a kind of a glimpse of light for him. Oh, here's maybe a tool that I can use to help. And so he then really got into long distance swimming. And ultimately, one of his dream goals was to swim the length of Loch Lomond, which is the second largest lake in Scotland, 22 miles long. And so to combine kind of all this together into a story, he decided to do that last year. He asked me if I wanted to join him. I said, I'd love to. I said, but how about I'm going to do it with a twist, which is to do that whole swim totally fasted to demonstrate the amazing abilities of our bodies that they can just utilize fat as fuel. You don't need carbohydrates to fuel athletic endeavor. And so I ultimately trained for and then did that swim, which took us, 12 hours. I did so totally fasted, but I was also very low carbohydrate going into that swim. So effectively, I had very little carbohydrates in my body. A 12-hour swim within, a 24-hour fasting window burned, 12, 13,000 calories. And if you think, even if you're eating carbohydrates, we can only store around 2,000 calories, of carbohydrates. But I really wanted to do something to demonstrate that, carbohydrates are just being really overutilized as a tool, and people really need to think about metabolic flexibility. But also, for me, the two best tools for managing chronic diseases and reversing them are low carbohydrate diets and fasting, especially, for cancer. But the same applies for, I would say, for pretty much all of the chronic diseases. And so, yeah, so that swim with my brother was a kind of a super, super special swim. But it really was to, kind of raise awareness and do something that people think is kind of, not possible to do, to really showcase kind of how amazing, not to say that everybody should try and do this. The point is, you really need to think about your mitochondria, metabolic flexibility, and how can you make sure that your body is able to utilize both fat and ketones as a fuel source, as well as carbohydrates and or glucose. Because if you over rely on carbohydrates, your body forgets the second side, and actually that is one of the primary drivers of pretty much all of the chronic diseases.
Hmm. It reminds me, in my 40s and early 50s, I trained Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I took a lunchtime class, one of the toughest classes taught by a master, John Danaher at Renzo Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And the room was just filled with very talented, very athletic, very skilled practitioners. And I wasn't any of those. And I remember changing up how I went about it by fasting going into the class. And it's something I never would have dreamed of. And all of a sudden, I felt like stronger and lighter on my feet, as if my body wasn't working on digestion while it was also trying to, I guess, protect my life against some of these, very skilled practitioners. So it definitely reminds me of that. Tell me, there's different definitions of fasting. What do you consider fasting? And for somebody who's first getting into it, not necessarily looking to swim for 12 hours, what's your view on fasting?
Yeah, sure. So all of these things are personal and contextual based on your kind of situation and circumstance. So I would just say that first and foremost, my view on it is I think it's a powerful tool that everybody should utilize more. And the simplest way, to lean into it is just to try and start with effectively a 12-hour, fasting window. So try and, finish your last meal of the day and then have, start 12 hours before, no snacks, 12 hours before you have, your next meal. So if you have dinner at 6 p.m., then, wait till at least 6 a.m. to have breakfast. Or if you don't finish dinner till, 8 p.m., wait till 8 a.m., no kind of snacks in between. So, just I would say start there. And then you can start to gradually extend, that window, not necessarily every day. I think that's another thing that I've learned over the years is I used to think more of everything is better. And ultimately, I did actually get into a state where I probably did myself, or let's just say I wasn't optimal because I was actually fasting too much. And if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, again, our bodies are designed, more for fast, feast, fast, feast. So I think just starting there, gradually expanding, that window up to 14 hours to 16 to kind of 18, I think, and then, seeing what you feel comfortable with and getting your body feeling, comfortable with being hungry. Similar to you, I find when I'm towards the end of my fast, actually, I find because your body is then starting to produce ketones, the brain thrives on ketones, you actually get kind of more energy and kind of more mental clarity doing that. But obviously it takes a while to adjust and adapt to that. So I would say start there. But I am a big fan from a preventative perspective of doing, more kind of, longer fasts once you've built up that foundational metabolic flexibility. So, anywhere from 3 to 5 day fasts, which you can do in, multiple different ways. You can obviously do kind of much more of a strict, kind of water and electrolyte only fast. There's a lot of, kind of people now talking about, sardine and olive oil kind of, fasts. Or actually, for me, the simplest tool and the way I got into it, and I think one of the most accessible ways is so Volta Longo's company Prolon do a 5 day fasting mimicking diet where you can effectively kind of order a box and they've done a ton of kind of science around it and you get 800 to 1,000 calories of specific foods that don't trigger off the nutrient system. So I do find that for a lot of people is quite an accessible way to do it because you still, you're still at least kind of, nourishing yourself a little bit. It's not quite as all out as doing, a 3 or a 5 day fast. And so, but, either one of those, but you only need to do that, I think, a few times a year because really that extended fast really puts the body into kind of a state where it's doing cellular cleanup, it's ramping kind of your immune system up, and I think that's where you get a significant, obviously, amount of kind of health benefits from it, which helps kind of almost reset your system, reset your metabolism. And so I would say, starting off from the kind of, the short fasts, building up to including that, but, in between that, yeah, having days, or even weeks where you do feast a little bit more because the body is also used to feasting. The problem is in modern day, the vast majority of people are feasting every day, and because a lot of the foods have specific ingredients in there which ultimately create mitochondrial dysfunction. They send out hunger signals for you to eat more. Fructose and high fructose corn syrup is probably the best, example of this. It is ultimately a mitochondrial toxin, and your mitochondria think, I'm not getting enough energy. They send out hunger signals for you to eat more because they're not getting the right nutrients and input signals they need to create energy and function properly. And so, there's just all feast and no fast, and our bodies simply aren't designed for that.
Question I have for you is if you could wave a magic wand, how would you improve health outcomes in the US, and maybe while lowering healthcare costs?
Wow. If I had a magic wand, I would educate every single doctor, physician, healthcare provider in metabolic knowledge and that lifestyle interventions for the vast majority of people can actually be more powerful than the pharmaceutical interventions. And because ultimately, I think so much of this is down to education, and it's well documented that, nutrition, fasting, all these things, they're not taught at all in kind of in medical school. And the vast majority of clinics these days pay very little attention. It's starting to, there's kind of an early curve. But if I could wave a magic wand and do that, and ultimately I would love for Metabolic Wise to be the kind of knowledge companion to help every single clinician, because still the vast majority of people do rely on, their doctors and their healthcare providers for the kind of their course of treatment. That is changing. People are now moving to online resources because, the last kind of 4 or 5 years, I think there is a lot of trust that's kind of eroded, within that system, but still that's where the majority of people go to. So yeah, I would educate every single kind of doctor, physician. And again, because the combination of the two, as we discussed, potentially for some people with GLP, although I'd still rather just use lifestyle, but I'm also a pragmatist, and that some people need that kind of, that quick lift off. But I do think that the vast majority of people with access to that knowledge then would dramatically improve their health. And this is something which is foundational across every single one of the chronic diseases, and so would be the biggest lever, I think, to reverse and prevent chronic diseases, which account for 72% of all of the deaths worldwide.
Yeah, I really like that answer. As a nation, we spend more per capita on healthcare than anyone else in the world, and yet have some of the worst outcomes outside of acute care, as you mentioned earlier. And if practitioners were more integrated into metabolic health, a lot of that money that we're spending could be shifted towards things like helping get access to healthier food. Neil, tell us about some of the research that Metabolic Wise is based on as well. Tell us a little bit more about the advisory board that you put together.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously having a kind of world leading science advisory board is really critical to us to make sure that we are building the kind of tech platform on the best science, knowledge, and research. So we've got an amazing science advisory board. Ben Bickman, Matt Bernstein, Lucia Aronica, Adrian Sotomoto, David Jockers, and Sarah Pugh are some of the kind of world's leaders in different aspects of metabolic health. For example, Ben Bickman is very well renowned as a cell biologist, kind of insulin resistance, and so forth. Matt Bernstein on metabolic psychiatry, Lucia on epigenetics and kind of nutrition, Sarah Pugh on quantum biology and metabolic health. So ultimately, all of them have got kind of this notion of mitochondrial function as a foundation, but then there's kind of different areas of expertise that kind of overlap. So that gives us a nice, I would say, broad, diverse base. What we then do is we develop a kind of a set of almost kind of metabolic and mitochondrial health principles. And there is tons of science and research over the last 100 years, which really highlights kind of the root cause of these chronic diseases related to metabolic and mitochondrial dysfunction, and many studies into kind of different therapies. The challenge is so much of that is dwarfed, and we spoke earlier about cholesterol and heart disease and LDL. There are literally tens of thousands of papers around LDL and effectively how to lower LDL, using different drugs and pharmacological approaches. Whereas there's a small number of papers really focused on actually truly the other things that cause heart disease and how do you tie that together. So what we really do is try to then still bring all of the published science that kind of really is focused on root cause metabolic and mitochondrial health and the links to that to all of the different diseases, and use that as effectively kind of the base of knowledge and content. What we also do though is we tie in podcasts and YouTube videos and articles, because not everybody is able to read 10 papers and kind of understand that. So the chatbot can help you understand the concepts for it, but if you want to then dig deeper, you can either ask Metabolic Wise more detailed questions, or You can link out to a podcast or a YouTube video and dive into, for example, we spoke about heart disease and the role of structured or, fourth phase water. And so you'll be able to find, a YouTube clip which really goes into detail around that one specific aspect to really help connect you to different learning resources to learn the way that you do. But ultimately, all of this is kind of guided by principles that the Science Advisory Board, have put in place to kind of govern and make sure that we effectively have robust science and clinical evidence. The final thing I would say is one of the principles that we have is really focusing on, actual health outcomes rather than just isolated biomarker outcomes, because, the kind of prevailing paradigm is you need to drive LDL down as low as you can, but actually much of the research shows that people with higher LDL levels actually live longer. And when you realize that, cholesterol and ultimately LDL is a foundational molecule that helps build your hormones, 20% of your brain effectively is cholesterol, and your brain and body makes cholesterol. You're like, doesn't it make sense? Like, if our bodies, make this, like, surely there needs to be this kind of, optimal level that we kind of have. And so much of this is down to, kind of the root cause. And my personal belief, on all of this is, if ultimately, if you restore metabolic and mitochondrial function and signals, the rest of your biomarkers will ultimately kind of normalize in, what's right for you, as long as you are mitigating some of the impacts of the modern environment, cardiovascular disease, for one example. So, structured water and your body's ability to produce structured water, natural light is important, but, also kind of non-native EMF exposure can also effectively kind of interrupt how ultimately your body and your mitochondria work. And so there's this kind of just constant balance of, if you do those foundational things, then ultimately, I think your body will kind of normalize, a lot of the other biomarkers within the range, that it's supposed to. So we really focus on the health outcomes. Are people reversing diseases? Are they getting into better health? Are they getting, into better energy? And ultimately, that is the kind of the primary signal that we use, rather than did you move an isolated biomarker.
So, last question for you. Tell us about Metabolic Wise and the fundraising environment that you're in today.
Yeah, of course. So we've just launched our kind of, public beta and actively, fundraising right now. I think the challenge is so many of the funds out there are chasing the next drug, the next pharma thing, because you can patent it, it has IP, the potential returns on that. The whole system is set up for that. So I think the challenge that we face is we're running a little bit counter to that. So finding aligned, VC companies and investors that actually truly believe in ultimately empowering people and kind of true root cause health. And maybe the returns, if successful, won't be as big as with a patented drug if that turns out to be effective. But this is knowledge that everybody kind of should have access to. So I would say that's a little bit of the challenge, which is why it's been obviously kind of amazing to connect with you as somebody who kind of understands this world. But a little bit like, with where you asked me about the kind of, the healthcare system, and many of the doctors and clinicians ultimately don't have knowledge and understanding about metabolic health. It's a similar in the VC and the fundraising world. So there's actually a lot of effort to kind of educate people and get them over the hump that there is an alternative way, but also this alternative way, sits a little bit outside of the kind of, the big food, big pharma kind of ecosystem. So it's definitely, I would say, challenging. But my hope is that, as more and more momentum gets behind the metabolic health effort, which is happening right now, there's more and more knowledge, more and more people are reversing, because that's when it really hits you, is when you either yourself or, a loved one who reverses a disease, which is, supposedly not possible using metabolic therapy. That's when I would say the penny kind of truly drops. And I think there are more and more, cases like that happening each day. And it's part of the plans of Metabolic Wise to really make those accessible to, to people. And so they can be these other inspirational beacons of light that can help other people.
Terrific. Hey, Neil, it's been a pleasure to chat with you. One of the reasons why I do this podcast is to help highlight companies and people like yourself that are trying to make a difference, and help to build that network of investors as well as entrepreneurs that are trying to fix this issue. For sure, in my mind at least, the approach you're taking is needed to help people get educated and to know that there is an alternative to just taking more and more drugs and more surgeries and not feeling great in their journey. The idea of not just increasing lifespan, but health span. Uh, Again, thank you, Neil. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Rob. Really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, much appreciated.